Okay. Hmm. Greetings, Earthlings. My name is Leslie Lobotomy, and welcome to Weird New Mexico. It's episode number 2, UFO crashes and sightings. I'm going to talk about some events that are little known, if known at all. And, meaning strange lights, green fireballs, a fleet of ships in the sky, all in broad daylight, witnessed by hundreds, if not thousands of people. I'll be talking about the UFO crash and the Socorro event and the Farmington Armada, which I had just briefly described. But first, as in every episode, I'm going to start off with a little bit of a light education of our New Mexico culture out here. And today it's going to be green chili. I lightly touched on it last time, but I didn't go into it. I said I'd save it for next time because I'm running for time. But this is, the green chili is very important to us Native New Mexicans. It's our soul, it's our heart, it's our blood, it's in our DNA. To us, it's nothing to joke about. I mean, for real, we take it pretty seriously. In fact, there are memes out there where Colorado, they try to compete with us on green chili, and theirs is nothing like New Mexico green chili. Yeah, it's really funny, but you'd have to really know the green chili to understand just how good it is. But I love Colorado, but it's okay. It's no big deal. So we don't like it that much. Hang on, fix that. We don't like it that much, but we do put it in everything. Yeah, anything you can think of, we'll put the green chili in it. It's like how people will put tomatoes in anything or onions in anything. That's how we are with green chili. We put it in soups and stews and pizzas and salads and pastas. And it's pretty much mandatory that every native New Mexican knows how to make something out of the green chili, whether it be any of those things. But most likely, people really love the green chili chicken enchiladas. Every restaurant has a version of it, a variant of that, or my favorite, the green chili bacon cheeseburger. Oh my gosh, those are so good. They're dreamy. We have a local, well, it's a state corporate restaurant that features that as part of their business. And I don't really want to do any promotion, so I better not say anything. I might get in trouble. I don't want to go to internet jail or whatever. But so this is run a little too long, but so I'll start off with the state question. It's a detrimental question, and the question is red or green. And yep. Red or green. There really isn't a wrong answer, but there is a correct answer. The right answer is green. It'll always be green for the native New Mexican. And red will usually be a preference to people who aren't from here, who have come from, say, Colorado or Texas or Oklahoma. They're more accustomed to, well, like in Texas, they're more accustomed to jalapenos. Jalapenos is more their thing. But the green chili, I lived in Portland, Oregon for a couple years, and when I first went there, I was really jonesing for some green chili. I mean, like I said, it's in our blood. It's part of our DNA. So I mentioned it, in conversation, and nobody knew what I was talking about. Everybody thought I was from another planet, which isn't new. I think I am. But anyway, they said it sounded really gross. I guess they thought I was talking about moldy cowboy style chili or something. I don't know. So that does sound gross. But though that's not what I was talking about. But the best of our green chili comes from Hatch, and Hatch, New Mexico is the label of New Mexico green chili, known in the Hatch Valley in and around Hatch, New Mexico, which has large acreages dedicated to the crop, and it's an important crop to New Mexico and to our economy and our culture. It's very important. And it's sold worldwide in places including Europe, Australia, and Japan now. Well, I really wonder how much it costs there, being that watermelons cost a fortune. But the flavor of New Mexico green chilies has been described as a lightly pungent, similar to an onion, or like a garlic with a subtly sweet, spicy, crisp smoky taste. And typically the smoky taste will be because they're roasted. We roast them out here. We don't can, but I'll get to that in a minute. But the ripened red chilies retains the flavor, and that's where you get the difference. The question red or green. Green is obviously not quite ripe yet, and red is ripest to its fullest extent, I guess. But it's still to all of it, most of us, we think the flavor is most prevalent when it's green before it gets to the red. But you have to pick it before it gets to that red. Is there's a perfect balance, just like with anything, like with fruits, whether they're ripe or not, and when the right time to pick them is. But it's harvest season right now, so it's appropriate to talk about this. Too bad that I don't have smell-o-vision here, so you can smell what it smells like to roast the green chili. It's really cool. It's almost like in the cartoons, those old cartoons. Like I remember seeing a Tom and Jerry where Tom could smell a pie, and there was this odor smell wave, and he was all following it all the way. There was the pie in the window, and he got in trouble, of course. Anyway, going back to the ripened red chilies, and these bring the earthiness and bite. Now the earthiness is true, but I can't say there's really a bite to it. The greens have more bite, and the aging mellows from a front heat to a back heat. Now, if you don't know what that means, the front heat is when you first take the bite. You feel that heat automatically, instantly, and then it'll dissipate. And then the back heat is the kind where you don't taste it at first until a little bit after you're done chewing it, and you're in trouble at that point. You should always have something on standby for that. It get intense. But if you have culinary school experience, you know all about that. So I'm not. That's beside the point. So and the spiciness depends on the variety of the chili pepper itself. So there's many types of chili plants that were first grown by the Pueblo Indians. And the Pueblo Indians are descendants of the first peoples that were here in our state. And there'll be an episode on all of that too at some point soon. So anyway, the Pueblo residents who continue to grow their own strains, they each with a distinct pungent sweetness, taste, and heat. And for example, the Zia Pueblo Chile has a bittersweet flavor when it matures into its red color. And when the Spanish arrived, they introduced the European cultivation techniques to the chili plants and eventually created cultivars of their towns. And so the New Mexico type cultivars were developed by pioneer horticulturist Dr. Fabian Garcia, whose major release was the New Mexico number 9 in 1913. And these cultivars are hotter than the others to suit the taste of New Mexicans in their traditional foods. And the selective breeding began with 14 lineages of Pasilla, Colorado, and Negro cultivars from throughout New Mexico and southern Colorado. There you go, where Colorado comes in on this whole enterprise. So these first commercially viable peppers were created to have a larger, smoother, fleshier, more tapering, shoulderless pod for canning. And this is where I get into the more roasting, because I don't recall ever seeing anybody canning green chilies. They're always roasted. Even on your back grill, we've done that, because people grow green chilies like people grow tomatoes. Like around the country, people just like grow abundance of tomatoes and corn, strawberries, and we grow those too. But we also have the green chilies, and again, it's harvest time right now, September, October. The state fair was just recent, so I'm sure you could smell the smell of roasting green chili throughout the entire fairgrounds. And in Albuquerque, it's a pretty big one. New Mexico State Fair is pretty big because it coincides with the balloon fiesta. But anyway, going on to the New Mexico chili plants. And they're highly sought after since their flavor, texture, and hardiness are heavily dependent on their growing environment. That makes a huge difference. The growing environment. See, that's why in Colorado they're not that great, because they're at a higher elevation and there's more humidity in the air. See, the plants were originally grown by the Pueblo, and each of their distinct Pueblo plants grows best in heritage soil. So that's why along the Rio Grande, the moisture is okay because it's the soil. The soil's got the appropriate minerals and nutrients that it needs. Otherwise, the further south you go, the better it has as far as the flavor and the heat. Hence why everybody migrates to Hatch in southern New Mexico, which is nearby Roswell, and they bring back gallons and pounds of green chili around the state. And so the same trend of cultivating this green chili and varieties grown by the Spanish, Mexican, and American frontiersmen as well. And among the New Mexico grown chili, the ones with the most accolades are grown along the Rio Grande, as I had just mentioned, especially along the Hatch Valley, because the Hatch Valley does sit about east of the Rio Grande in the southern part of the state. And multiple other locations in the Rio Grande Valley outside of Hatch Valley also grow award-winning chili in their own right. And the towns and cities across New Mexico have strong chili traditions like Chimayo, Española, Lemetar, San Antonio, and Albuquerque metro area. And around Albuquerque, there's the Bosque and the Corrales, Los Ranchos de Albuquerque, and the Bosque Farms. Very nice places. Very nice places to visit. Very good green chili. And another option, when there's a question, there is another answer to the straight question of red or green. You can always answer Christmas. That obviously means both, as you could tell. Sorry about the shuffling of papers. But now I'm going to move on to topic that we've come to this episode. I'm going to start talking about the UFOs and space. And first of all, what I'm going to come to is the Very Large Array Radio Telescope. Now, the Very Large Array is one of the world's largest premier astronomical radio observatories, consisting of 27 radio antennas in a Y-shaped configuration that dot along the plains of San Augustine, about 55 miles west of Socorro. And each antenna is about 25 meters or 82 feet in diameter, and the data from the antenna is combined electronically to give the resolution of the antenna to 36 kilometers or 22 miles across, with the equivalent sensitivity of a dish 130 meters or 422 feet across. And on March 31st in 2012, the array was renamed the Carl G. Jansky Very Large Array after the discovery of radio waves emanating from the Milky Way galaxy. Carl Jansky subsequently became one of the founding fathers of radio astronomy, and recent updates to the array have replaced the 1970s era electronics with state-of-the-art receiving and processing equipment. So it's near Socorro, but this didn't pick up the Socorro incident at all because it wasn't even built yet, because the Socorro incident took place in the 60s and this one was done in the 70s. So on we continue to tell you that the investigation of UFOs has been going on for hundreds of thousands of years. It's been recorded in past documents that have been lost, have been found, and have been kept in hiding. It's the unidentified flying objects are not a new phenomenon. In 503 BC, Ezekiel recorded a whirlwind to the north, which appeared as a fiery orb. In 1251, at St. Alban-Abbey, when the moon was 8 days old, there appeared in the sky a ship elegantly shaped, well-equipped, and marvelous in color. In 1520, in France, there were sighted a round-shaped object with rotating lights and 2 fiery suns. In 1874, in Texas, a farmer in his field reported seeing a dark flying object in the shape of a disc rushing at a wonderful speed. And these are just a couple of the many events reported by historians throughout time. Not to mention the more ancient ones like the Sumerians, the Mayans, and of course the ancient Egyptians. And there's even Norse legends. There's legends all over that go through all the time of visitors, sightings, and such. Now, when it comes to New Mexico, everybody knows that the Roswell incident in 1947 as being New Mexico's most famous UFO event. I'm not going to talk about Roswell because everybody knows everything there really is to find out about Roswell. I mean, there's even a TV show, which I've never watched it because, well, I don't need to. So, but there have been several of others of note, as like the lore of the Aztec UFO crash in March of 1948. Not quite even an entire year later, and it's sometimes referred to as the other Roswell, and it includes the recovery of numerous bodies. See, that's what makes it very interesting. And this is where I'm from. I live in Aztec, New Mexico, and we have, we had a UFO convention there for a while annually, and that was pretty cool. I actually got to meet David Hatcher Childress on one of the years, so and I bought a book and he signed it. It was nice. But I live about 3 miles away from the actual crash site. In this program, at the very end, are included photos of the crash site and surrounding area. So got a little bit of visual aid to help you there, and as far as that one goes. But again, continuing on, I'll also talk about the unusual green fireballs over northern New Mexico in the late 1940s, which was a subject of government investigation. And the big one is the Farmington UFO Armada, and that happened from March 15th through the 18th in 1950. And that was witnessed by not only fully half the town's population, but also by others around northern New Mexico. And it's pretty interesting. You know, like I'm surprised I found as much information as I did about it. And then we'll mention the Socorro UFO that happened in April of 1964. That was witnessed by a police officer and seemed to involve the landing and takeoff of an unusual vehicle with occupants. And then there's Dulce, New Mexico. Now, there's not enough time to talk about Dulce today with all this other stuff. There's so much going on about that's going to be a whole other episode in itself. It may even end up being a two-parter because it will deal with the underground tunnel network under the continent of North America. But again, that's a whole other time. Right now, because locals there, they report that the underground alien base continues to have reports of UFO sightings in the area. And there's no definitive physical evidence of any of these events of any of them in the folklore history of our state of New Mexico. So, and here I am going to talk about it. But to further introduce, about New Mexico and its history of UFOs, we are one of the most UFO-centric states in the country, with the 1947 Roswell alien encounter not being just an isolated incident, like I said. The Land of Enchantment is listed as the state with the fifth most UFO sightings per capita in the United States in a study from the satelliteinternet.com. From January 2019 to 2020, New Mexico had 130 sightings in almost every region of the state, reported by the National UFO Reporting Center. And see, the sightings of lights and things in the sky happen so often, we just never know. We just never know. So, there's this one day on May 5th, 2021, it seemed like aliens might have come to New Mexico again. And at 10:30 p.m., strange, bright, blinking lights were flying in a very unusual formation, were seen over downtown Albuquerque skies by numerous people. I mean, Albuquerque's a metro. I mean, there's a lot of people there. And, but it turns out they may not have been life forms anyway. So it turns out it was Elon Musk's SpaceX that took credit for the lights, saying that they were the SpaceX satellites that were being part of the Starlink system, that this company is developing, which is a really nice thing to do in our area because there's a lot of desolate, barren, isolated areas out here. If you've ever seen The Hills Have Eyes, that's a pretty accurate description as to how barren and scary and wide and how you could get lost out here and have no way of contacting anybody. I mean, even family areas, not just in the middle of nowhere, places where no one will ever find you. and no one will ever hear you scream. And so we have these numerous accounts of lights in the sky, and we never know what it is. But this time, on May 5th, 2021, it did have an explanation. It wasn't being hidden by the government or military or anything, so that was pretty cool. There are still the unanswered questions about whether an incidents happen like on February 21st, 2021, just, like what, 3 months before that. And that's why there was so much concern in May, is an encounter straight out of the X-Files happened when a radio came to, or someone had radioed, something was radioed into the FAA's Albuquerque Air Route Traffic Control Center. The incident involved sightings. The incident was reported by pilots of an Airbus A320 being buzzed by an unidentified cylindrical shaped object moving at a high speed, which resulted in them querying the FAA's Albuquerque Air Route Traffic Control Center. And the American Airlines aircraft was headed to Phoenix at about 1:19 p.m. Central Time, while over the northeast corner of New Mexico, flying at about 37,000 feet. The pilot radioed to the Albuquerque Center the following message on the Albuquerque Center frequency: "Do you have any targets up there? We just had something go right over the top of us, and I hate to say this, but it looked like a long cylindrical object that almost looked like a cruise missile of some type of thing, moving really fast over the top of us." A recording of the pilot's transmission was made by a self-described stealth chaser blogger named Steve Douglas from Amarillo. Not too far. He accidentally intercepted the transmission as he was trying to pick up another aircraft at the radio scanner. No reply was ever monitored by Albuquerque back because air traffic controllers walked right over it, Douglas said on his blog. The air traffic control broadcast from American Airlines at AA 2292 is posted on Douglas's blog called Deep Black Horizon. I wanted to going a little further into that blog, but again, I'm strapped for time. My last episode lasted almost an hour, and I wasn't planning on that. And so, going on, the American Airlines aircraft flew on from New Mexico to land in Phoenix, Arizona. Initially, American Airlines' statement was, "At this time, we do not have any indication the radio transmission was from the flight crew on board American Airlines Flight 2292. In a later update, the company confirmed the incident with a statement saying the transmission came from that flight. "Following a debrief with our flight crew and additional information received, we can confirm this radio transmission was from American Airlines Flight 2292 on February 21st, a spokesman for American Airlines had said. The statement referred further questions to the FBI. Of course, one by one, various military, state, local, federal agencies, and others issued statements of their own. The FBI is aware of the reported incident, and while our policy is to neither confirm nor deny investigations, the FBI works continuously with our federal, state, local, and tribal partners to share intelligence and protect the public." Scott Steams, the chief of public affairs of White Sands Missile Range in southern New Mexico, said, "We have no idea what it could have been or if anything similar has been sighted in that area before. We never test in that area." The Federal Aviation Administration spokesman Ian McGregor confirmed the encounter, stating that a pilot reported seeing an object over New Mexico shortly after noon local time on Sunday, February 21st, 2021. The FAA air traffic controllers did not see an object in the area on their radar scopes. So the Albuquerque Kirtland Air Force Base spokeswoman Lolly Laxford stated, "We have no knowledge of this. We are not aware of anything." So nobody's saying anything. Nobody sees, nobody knows. And even the Pentagon, the Pentagon spokesman stated that the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, known as DARPA, the Missile Defense Agency, and U.S. Strategic Command didn't conduct any tests from the missile range that Sunday. Holloman Air Force Base, which is also located in the southern part of New Mexico, and it said they saw nothing up there. Which brings Bill Nye to speculate, the science guy. It's probably one of the military just not telling the other part of the military what they're up to. Of course, right? So as to what the pilots on the aboard the American flights 2292 could have actually seen, the truth is still up for grabs. The description of a missile-like object also fits with documented encounters of U.S. Navy fighter pilots with abnormal objects off the eastern seaboard throughout the last decade. The Dora military operating area is located in the area where the UFO was encountered. However, there are procedures in place if a missile could have gone off the reservation during a test, and pilots would have been alerted to the safety hazard. And I'd like to think so, right? So, other standard military explanations seem very unlikely. The area of encounter isn't a place where a cruise missile munition would even be let loose. The idea that it could have been some sort of clandestine aircraft is also highly unlikely, as it could have been operating during the day and without communicating with air traffic control over unrestricted airspace. So, the airline pilots would have been alerted to the airspace being hot and to other potential conflicts. So, there you have it. And that's just like, what, not even 2 years ago? So, starting in 1947 with Roswell, all the way up to that date that is recorded so far, further research would have to be needed, and I'm going to do that eventually. But now, I'm going to take a little break for now. So, get a drink.
While I show you some of what's about to happen, peekaboo. I know what you do, 'cause I do it too. So put your hands on your face and cover up your eyes. Don't look until I signal, peekaboo. Or say you don't care. If you cannot see it, you think it's not there.
Hello, and welcome back to this second episode of Weird New Mexico. And you might notice that it took a couple days to get all these recordings done, so you may notice a difference between each video. So, continuing on, I'm just going to go ahead and get right to it. The Aztec, New Mexico UFO crash happened on March 25th, 1948, near Aztec, New Mexico, in a place called Hart Canyon, which lies 12 miles northeast from Aztec to the north. And I live 1 mile north of Aztec on that same highway, but I live off of in a rural canyon, and that canyon connects to Hart Canyon. So technically, if you go that back way, I'm only 3 miles away from that crash site. But if you take the highway, it's 12 miles. But either way, you're going to be driving on a lot of dirt road, no matter what. What's really interesting about the UFO crash of Aztec is that there were actually bodies recovered. It says that there were 16 3-foot-tall bodies, humanoid bodies, and a plaque was placed at the site to commemorate that there was a crash site there for further education. So, it was discovered atop a lonely mesa, and it was a large metallic object with over a dozen humanoid bodies found inside. The UFO conventions we used to have that also commemorated the event. We don't have them anymore because we had to do a lot of fundraising. And when it comes to libraries, there isn't really a whole lot of fundraising going on with that. But they were the ones that would bring the conventions, but you could still check out the website at cityofaztec.com and see all kinds of cool stuff that we have. But this plaque, author Scott Ramsey and his wife Suzanne had left the plaque in 2007 that tells the story of the recovery of this vehicle. Others, Scott Ramsey mentions, and there was a photo of a large concrete slab that is laying out there, and Scott Ramsey believes that that was used in part of the recovery process. But others disagree. But in any event, the area is really beautiful. They still have the Alien Bike Run trail out there that goes to the site and around. It's really nice, really nice. But first of all, this plaque, I left a picture of the plaque, but you can't read it, no matter how much I tried to zoom. But it says that on or about this site, on March 25th, 1948, a spacecraft of origins unknown crashed or landed on this mesa. It is alleged that the Los Alamos radar station in nearby El Vado, New Mexico, had tracked the air landing to the site. A high security recovery operation was led by the Air Force and the 5th Army Division, and they were responsible for the removal of this craft. And the recovery operation took about 2 weeks to all together to get everything cleaned up, and the remains were being taken to Los Alamos laboratories for scientific study and evaluation. And later it was rumored that they took everything, all the materials, to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. So the recovery of this craft by the U.S. government and military was one of the most secretive recoveries of a spacecraft with origins unknown since the similar recoveries in Roswell, New Mexico, just 8 months earlier. Don't really know how much data could be collected between those months. But anyway, the spacecraft was approximately 100 feet in diameter and 18 feet tall. And it was one of the most intact crafts that the government has ever recovered at that time. But sadly, all occupants, as many as 16, died as a result of this crash, making the full disclosure of both purpose and origin all but impossible. This plaque has been placed here to bring awareness to an event that has been kept secret for 59 years and is a significant part of our nation's history. Cite Scott and Suzanne Ramsey, March 25th, 2007. Now, I'd like to touch base right now about those bodies. There's a theory out there that I tend to believe, and it states that the bodies weren't 3 foot tall. They were actually about 6 foot tall, and they, yes, were humanoid, but they looked just like us, humanoid, just like us. There was only 8 bodies recovered, and they weren't really recovered, but they were alive. They were found alive and well, and they were dressed. It was noted that their attire was very 19th century with yet a modern and futuristic look to it. Now, being that this is 1948, it's hard to tell or know just what the people thought futuristic and modern looked like then, because as we all know, we've seen in TV shows and movies from the 50s that the spacesuits are all silvery, gold, glittery, shiny, with big collars and rings around their wrists. So who knows what they mean by that? But when I hear that, I tend to think of steampunk. So I wonder, that's up to the imagination, I suppose. So this hoax, it turned out to be a hoax. Not entirely. It started off as one. And so this story was first published in 1949 by author Frank Scully. It kind of makes me wonder if Agent Scully's name didn't come from this, inspired by this guy. But in the Variety magazine column, he published the story, and later in 1950, he published it in a book called Beyond the Flying Saucers. And later, in the mid 1950s, the story was exposed as a hoax fabricated by two confidence men by the names of Silas M. Newton and Leo A. Gebhauer, and as part of a fraudulent scheme to sell supposed alien technology. Beginning in the 1970s, some ufologists resurrected this story, and the books were claiming that the purported crash was real, that they had seen. So they decided to go into further investigate this, pick it back up. But in 2013, an FBI memo claimed by some ufologists to substantiate the crash story was dismissed by the Bureau as just second or third hand information that was never investigated. Of course. Well, that's how shit always is. So, according to Scully, in March 1948, an unidentified aerial craft containing 16 humanoid bodies was recovered by the military in New Mexico after making a controlled landing in Hart Canyon, 12 miles northeast of Aztec. And the craft was said to be, like I said, 100 feet diameter, 18 feet tall, and the largest UFO to date that's ever been recovered. But Scully had named the two men identified as Newton and Gebhauer, who reportedly told him that the incident had been covered up and the military came and had taken the craft for secret research. So Scully wrote that the UFO, along with other flying saucers that captured by the government, came from Venus and worked on magnetic principles. According to Scully, the inhabitants had stocked the concentrated food and heavy water for drinking purposes and consumption, and every dimension of the craft was divisible by 9. So that makes interesting, because that tells me or suggests that sacred geometry was involved in the design and manufacture of this vehicle. So, science writer Martin Gardner criticized Scully's story as full of wild imagination and scientific howlers. So, one guy gets into information and then there's another guy that has to debunk it. Isn't that the way it's always been? So, regarding the hoax, during the late 1940s and into the 1950s, Silas Newton and Leo Gebhauer traveled through Aztec attempting to sell devices known in the oil business as doodlebugs. They claimed that these devices could find oil and gas and gold, and that they could do so because they were based on alien technology that was recovered from a flying saucer. When J.P. Kahn of the San Francisco Chronicle had asked these men to provide one of these pieces, the sample that they gave him turned out to only be simple aluminum. So in 1949, the author Frank Scully published a series of columns in Variety magazine retelling the crash story told to him by Newton and Gebhauer. Okay, and so this influenced the public perception of UFOs. 4 years later, the hoax was exposed in True magazine. After the article was published, many victims of the pair came forward. One of these victims was the millionaire Herman Flater, who pressed charges, and so the two men were convicted of fraud in 1953. So everybody thinks it's a hoax now until later. So through the mid-1950s, through the 60s, into the early 1970s, the ufologists had considered the subject fully discredited and therefore avoided it. However, in the late 70s, author Leonard Stringfield had purported that not only was this incident real, but that the craft involved was one of many captured and stored by the U.S. military. And in later years, many had alleged that first-hand accounts of the Roswell crash actually contained stories from the Aztec crash story, with some claiming that the craft was impervious to extreme heat, any kind of heat, and others were claiming that the craft was damaged in the crash itself. The supposed humanoid bodies were said to measure between 36 inches and 42 inches. 6 feet tall in height and weigh around 40 pounds or 18 kilograms. Ufologists claim that shortly after the craft was downed, the military cleared the area of evidence, including the bodies, subsequently taking it to Hangar 18 at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. So, going back to the theory that these occupants were 6 foot tall humanoids, very much like us. There's a theory that they could be time travelers, possibly. And I would like to think that they were allowed to live and not get dissected or whatever. I don't know. I don't know what they would do. They probably have the ability to not allow that to happen. The occupants. So, as everything, the FBI gets involved. The FBI comes out in April 2011. The UFO enthusiasts had discovered what had become known as the Hottel Memo. Not sure how that's spelled, or pronounced, because it's spelled Hottel. So I'm just going to say Hottel. But this was available for viewing on the FBI Vault website. And though the memo had never been classified and had been making the rounds online for years, it was seen as proof of an official cover-up done by the U.S. government. And the memo contained the report of a man named Guy Hottel, who was the FBI agent at the time for the Washington field office. And this was addressed to J. Edgar Hoover and indexed in the FBI records, but because this was standard practice at the time, it was later discovered that Hottel's story was a retelling of a January 6, 1950 article published in the Wyandotte Echo, and that is a Kansas City, Kansas legal newspaper. The Wyandotte Echo itself was a retelling of the account of a local car salesman and a radio station advertising manager. After the memo was, ultimately the details within the FBI memo can be traced directly back to the initial hoax story. And after that memo was posted on the FBI website, it received over 1 million views over a period of 2 years. So I guess that's pretty good considering it's an FBI website, and I would think there'd be a lot of traffic going there. So in 2013, the FBI released a press release regarding this memo. In addressing the memo's context and possible connection to a hoax, the Bureau had wrote, "Finally, the Hottel Memo does not prove the existence of UFOs. It is simply a second or third-hand claim that we never investigated. Some people believe that the memo repeats a hoax that was circulating at the time, but the Bureau's files have no information to verify that theory." Of course not. And as I mentioned earlier, the incident had gave birth to the Aztec UFO Symposium, which was located here at our local library. And it was a fundraiser from 1997 to 2011. I remember going to the 07, the 08, and I think I went to the 10. The one in 2010. I don't remember a whole lot, but it was really nice that I did get to meet David Hatcher Childress there. I'd bought a book. He signed it, said, "Build your own Vimana," which I would really like to do someday. I'd like that. Hindu style, like old Vedic style. But, one of the big reason why it couldn't go on is because not enough money was being raised to bring the speakers that we wanted. I know there was a speaker that was scheduled to show, and I wish I could remember his name. Y'all know who he is, but he disappeared before the symposium, but he was scheduled to appear, and at that point nobody had heard from him, so we don't know about that. And then I'm pretty sure we had Bob Lazar as a guest one year. I didn't make it to that convention though, for numerous reasons. I think he might have been there, but when you bring notable people such as himself, you have to do a lot of fundraising, and people out in this area just don't do it. But that's okay. We're going to move on to the Socorro sighting, because it wasn't really, and you can't really call it an incident or an event. It was about a landing and a takeoff that was witnessed by a police officer of Socorro. So to lead in, I'll let you know that Socorro is a small town located about an hour's drive south of Albuquerque. I'd also mentioned earlier that Socorro is nearby the Very Large Array Radio Telescope Field, and it is only 55 miles away from it. So, in April 1964, Lonnie Zamora was a police officer with Socorro, and late in the afternoon of April 24th, he had just dropped his pursuit of a speeding vehicle on what he thought might have been an explosion on the outskirts of town. Thinking that a small shack containing dynamite may have exploded on the outside of town, he had made his way up an embankment and began moving slowly along a narrow gravel road that ran beside a small arroyo. Now, if you don't know what an arroyo is, it's a shallow, dry gully. It's mainly made of sand, and it'll have your typical desert weeds in it. They can be dangerous. Sometimes we call them washes, because when the floods come, the rains, it floods those things so bad they rage like rivers, and it can be dangerous. I have one sitting right next to my yard. Like it's like a raging river sometimes, so they can be dangerous. So stay out of those. So this arroyo, he comes across, and from this vantage point in the distance, he saw what he thought might have been an overturned vehicle. And so he radioed back to headquarters that he was going to go check this out, see what's going on. And it was from this same point that he saw what he described to be either two small children or two very small adults, and noted that one of them appeared to be startled at his approach and seemed to jump somewhat. Okay, so he drove further along the gravel road and finally stopped his car in a position to where he thought he was close enough to where he could get a better look at this vehicle. And it was at that time that he heard what he would later describe as several loud thumps, bumps, slams, similar to metal hitting metal. Leaving the patrol car and walking towards the gully, he had not gone more than a few steps before he had a view of the large, elongated, oval-shaped object on girder-like legs. And in that instant, there was a loud roar, and a bluish flame shot out from underneath the object. And Zamora didn't hesitate. He hit the ground thinking it was going to explode. So, thinking that it was going to explode, he got up, running, and jumped down on the other side of the gravel road there by his car. And he heard a whirring noise and watched the object rise up out of the arroyo. The legs that he had seen earlier were no longer apparent, and he watched the object rise about 20 feet above the bottom of this arroyo when suddenly the sound stopped completely. The flame was no longer visible, and as he watched, the now silent vehicle moved off, traveling parallel to the ground and picking up great speed as it left the area. He kept watching it as it moved farther and farther away, eventually until it disappeared from total view. Almost immediately, Zamora got on his car radio and excitedly called the dispatcher, hoping that somebody might see the object. But just as quickly, State Police Officer Sergeant Sam Chavez, who had heard Zamora's frantic call, had arrived on the scene. And together, Zamora and Chavez noted the evidence left in the arroyo, which contained a half-burned bush, 4 angular impressions in the sand soil where the legs may have been, and several small footprints and other impressions. So ever since this first report had come out, there was some type of symbol that was mentioned, and I put pictures earlier that had this vehicle, artists' visualization of this vehicle, and the symbol that they could gather from Lonnie Zamora's recollection. And so there has been some confusion about just what this symbol was, of course, and he had drawn it and described this symbol to several people soon after this incident, and what appeared to be discrepancies in his description had arose from various sources. There does appear to be some support for believing that the symbol that was widely circulated early may have actually been a variation of the true one. The idea, though, that investigative personnel from the Air Force or other government agencies may have circulated a substitute as a way to guard against copycat reports have some merit. So, though the actual shape may not be ultimately important to the overall case, a man spoke to Zamora, and this is what he says the following. I did make an effort to try to obtain an honest description of just what Zamora saw. In one of our telephone conversations, he clarified to me that he had never been told to not relate the actual shape. However, he then gave me a description that I realized was slightly different from any I had heard and seen before. And I was curious about this, and so shortly afterward, I sent him several packages that contained small sketches that covered various details of his sighting. And included were several variations of the symbol, along with one that matched what I had seen in other places, and another that had matched what I thought he had described to me. I asked him to place a check mark by whichever sketch matched his recollection, but all he was able to get was the sketch symbols that I provided earlier in the photos in the slideshow. So we don't really know what really happened here in Socorro, but there is no doubt that Lonnie Zamora had seen an object which left quite an impression on him. There's also no question about Zamora's reliability. He is a serious police officer, a pillar in his church, and a man well versed in recognizing airborne objects in the area. So he was really puzzled, and frankly so are we. This is the best documented case on record, and still have been unable, in spite of thorough investigation, to find the vehicle or any other stimulus that scared Zamora into the point of panic. So during the course of this investigation and immediately thereafter, everything that was humanly possible to verify was checked. Radiation in the landing area was checked by Geiger counters by the Kirtland Air Force Base. The Holloman Air Force Base Balloon Control Center was checked for balloon activity, and all local stations and Air Force were checked for release of weather balloon information. Helicopter activity was checked throughout the state of New Mexico, and government private aircraft were also checked. The reconnaissance division in the reconnaissance division in the Pentagon was also checked. White House Command Post was checked. Commander at Holloman Air Force Base was interviewed at length about special activities from his base, and there was nothing. Downrange controllers reported nothing. Nobody saw anything. Same story, different case, all the time. Well, so that does the coverage for Aztec UFO and the Socorro sighting. They keep calling all these things incidents, so I get a little, I start calling them incidents too, even though most of them can't really be classified as that. So next, I'm going to be talking about the Farmington Armada, which is really neat. This is a really peculiar, very interesting, because this is not recorded in any kind of FBI files. According to Dave Marler. Dave Marler is whom I've got this information I'm presenting today. So this is a situation that involved not just one, not just a couple, dozens, hundreds of ships in the sky that were witnessed by hundreds and thousands of people in 1950, called the Farmington Armada. So I'm going to take a break now. Going to get ready, get my papers together, and we'll see you real soon. Hey.
Now
Hello and welcome back. I am going to talk about the Farmington Armada. I'm going to go ahead and get right into it so I don't go over a whole lot of time. This show's running over what I wanted in the first place, as it is. So, excuse me. So, while I start right away with the Farmington Armada. Now, to further go into what I got here on the Farmington Armada is this is information that isn't really, you can't really find it anywhere except for in the local newspapers that printed about the story at the time. And there's lots of newspapers all over the state, all over the country. There's even from Latin American countries because this incident took over the period of 3 days. It was, sometimes they say it's 15th, 16th, 17th, but some say it's 16th, 17th, and 18th. The 17th, March 17th of 1950, was the day that had the most activity. So, going to read from an article from a Los Angeles Times paper that came out on March 18th, 1950. And it says that the headline reads, go ahead and show you that. Scores report seeing saucers flight in formation over Farmington, New Mexico. From the LA, Los Angeles Times. So, what it says here is on March 17th, a mass flight of flying saucers over this northwestern town in New Mexico, an oil-filled town of 5,000 population, was reported today by 50 persons, including businessmen and private pilots. Detailed accounts of this flight varied, but the witnesses estimated that the number of the objects, which appeared in groups commencing at 10:30 a.m. and lasting for 1 hour, from one to hundreds. The advertising manager of the Farmington Daily Times, Clayton Body, said he was with a group of 5 businessmen who saw a mass flight of the saucers. Body said they were all disc-shaped and fluttered through the air without descending to Earth. Among the saucers spotted by scores of people, the persons in Farmington, was a low-flying, red-hued, saucer-shaped object which streaked across the sky. Orville Ricketts, editor of the Times, said a cross-check of witnesses revealed that the object cleared the horizon in its tremendous speed in about 3 seconds. Ricketts said he did not see the objects, but that Body said that in the mass flight of saucers, he and 5 businessmen with whom he was standing believed they saw more than 100 of the strange objects. The town's business was brought practically to a standstill while persons scanned the skies. All of the objects were of a silvery color, except for the one red saucer, and all except the latter appeared to be at an extremely high altitude, Ricketts had said. And Ricketts had also mentioned that among the witnesses were several airplane pilots. Yeah, and it's interesting. Earlier in the first slideshow of the show, at the very end, I featured a photo of what it had looked to a witness looking up in the sky. Silver, they look like silver balls up in the clouds. That's the only picture that's been recovered of that day. So when you when you hear about UFOs, you always think of Roswell. Everybody thinks of Roswell because of the crash in July of 1947. But 3 years after that, in another part of the same state, on the opposite corner, there was a much bigger event. This Armada unknown aircraft had put on a spectacular display that, as I said earlier, lasted 3 days. So, as I mentioned earlier, this is a report done by David Marler. He did a full investigation. I'm guessing that this was released 5 years ago, maybe. So, what he says is, one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that the time period that this happened. It was just 3 years after the Roswell incident. And so in 1950 United States, there wasn't an organized body of investigating UFOs at all. So when you look around at the APRO, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, for example, they weren't formed until 1952. and 2 years after this event. So certainly the NICAP, the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, was formed later in 1957. And even the smaller organization, which was extremely active in the 50s, was CSI New York. They weren't formed until 1954. Who knew they started off with UFOs, right? So I think some of those organizations tried to maybe backtrack and look at this case, but without tools such as the internet like we have now, uh, the requests and things of that nature just were always basically left unsearched, virtually uninvestigated, and underappreciated. So really the only person to truly investigate this case was Dr. James McDonald. In 1968, he started investigating a lot of these historic cases that went abandoned, I guess you could say. And Farmington was one of those. And so it was his research that David Marler has gotten this information that I have for you today. So going back to March 1950, that was one of the most prominent, what was one of the most prominent projects in the state of New Mexico specifically was the development of the hydrogen bomb. Mentioned the Manhattan Project in the previous episode. So they're still working on bombs out there, and much of that work was being done at Los Alamos National Laboratories, which is about 120 miles by air east of Farmington. So we have to make a point, provide that historical context for what was going on at the time, in addition to any other number of military development work being done, say at White Sands, the Trinity site in the southern portion of the state. And for those that aren't familiar with Farmington, I think it's important to give you the location. It's right up here in the northwestern portion of New Mexico, very close to where I'm at in Aztec, probably about where this incident happened, probably about 16 miles away. And it's completely rural, very rural, and the main business we have out here that has supported the economy is petroleum, natural gas, oil, all that stuff. So it's primarily that business that has kept us alive. It's not so good anymore. A lot of the guys have moved to the Permian Basin or in the Colorado Plateau, which is just northwest of Permian, or they've gone to Montana, where drilling and fracking still continue. So, so these so at that time, this incident with this fleet of ships was front page news. And when you talk about the sightings, we have to underscore the fact that this was 2.5 to 3 days of broad daylight sightings of anywhere from a single to a dozen to hundreds. And it was also witnessed by hundreds and even thousands of people. I'd noticed that. So, when you're looking at a good UFO case, what's the measure as far as that goes? One object, dozen, hundreds? And what's interesting about this is the way the Air Force looked at this case. The Project Blue files, or the Project Blue Book files of Farmington, despite 3 days of broad daylight sightings of hundreds of discs. It's not listed. It's not listed in their monthly tally for the month of March 1950. However, if you're a tenacious researcher, as this guy was, and you dig further, he found redacted Air Force Office of Special investigation forums that were specific to the Farmington incident. And so in 2014, he had filed an FOIA request to try to get the unredacted documents. And much to his surprise, he was able to secure those, which also yielded additional witness names, which were redacted, of course, in the formally public documents that were there. So, obviously, the Air Force didn't want anybody to know about this. And so, especially in 1950, again, to provide some context, Captain Edward J. Ruppel, who was, of course, part of Project Blue Book in the 1950s, wrote in his book a report on unidentified flying objects. But still, one of the landmark books on the subject he referred to in this time period, circa 1950, was as the Dark Ages of UFO research. At that time, we have to understand it was Project Grudge. the Project Grudge umbrella, where there was a huge anti-UFO bias within the Air Force prior to Project Blowbug and after Project Sign, which was a much more liberal in their approach toward the subject. But it was interesting. It was an interesting time period in that respect. That not a lot of information was out there because of such a strong anti-UFO bias at the time. So, and you still got that. It's not so bad now because I've seen in several videos, reports, just anything that there's so many more believers of the UFO theory. Well, it's not really a theory. They're there. We've seen them. But aliens, and who knows? But because it was typified in Farmington over these 3 days, it was actually part of a larger wave of UFO sightings well documented, stretching from Colorado down into Mexico and even down into South America. And there are, as I mentioned earlier, original Latin American newspapers describing saucer sightings during this 3-day event. So I think it's very important, but just real quick, there's a brief run through in Tucumcari, New Mexico, which is on the opposite end of the state from Farmington on the east end. We had a flyover there too. And it was a solitary object that was documented in the Tucumcari Daily Times. And it was described as a saucer. They could tell it was a saucer because of the way it tipped and moved. And I have that little blurb right here that says Tucumcari made its bid for a part of Farmington's flying saucer fume today when Manuel Gutierrez and Ernest Dominguez, Bureau of Reclamation workers, said they sighted something yesterday. The men saw the object at 9:15 Friday morning, which was March 17th. And shortly before the saucers were first sighted in Farmington, they were working on the Hudson Canal. Gutierrez and Dominguez said the object, they would not hazard a guess as to its identity or what it could have been, but it circled to the right, then at times it stand still, and then took off against the wind in a great burst of speed. So that was later on that day, after they were in Farmington. So, it could appreciate it from different vantage points, which is interesting because that echoes other reports that we heard from Farmington, obviously. Because that was at 9:15, Friday, March 17th. So, it sounds perhaps they were moving in the west direction. Because then at 10:15 a.m. in Farmington, 5 to 9 saucers observed directly over Main Street departed to the northeast and were reported 45 minutes later to the west of town by other witnesses. At 10:30, hundreds, and that's a quote from the newspaper, of objects seen west of town from the Farmington Daily Times. 10:30, a red object was observed in 2 revolving discs, seen having a tussle in the sky. And we're going to come back to that red object later because it is actually an important aspect of the narrative. And so now we're having 10:30, another portion of the sky. There are revolving discs swooping and swerving and turning like a top, and were reported by many witnesses, all witnesses. And then at 10:35, 3 objects staged a daylight dogfight in front of everyone in the sky. And again, that's a direct quote from the newspaper, where these things seem to be interacting with one another. And at 11 o'clock a.m., we had a sighting of a solitary saucer-shaped object that circled town, came from the southwest, and departed to the northeast with a sudden burst of speed. So at 11 o'clock, 2 more metallic, smaller UFOs are moving very fast to the north, and a larger one was seen stationary. So these weren't objects blowing in the wind, not if one's stationary and others around it are moving. So now, 11:15 to 11:30, a swarm of hundreds of objects are observed. Red object is seen again and reported by witnesses. These departed to the northeast with a sudden burst of speed. And now at 2 o'clock, now we're into the afternoon, a silver object shaped like a rectangle with rounded ends was seen moving in a westerly direction. At 3 o'clock, fleets of hundreds again direct from the newspaper, flying information from the northeast heading to the southwest. At that same time, based on Albuquerque newspapers, there was a sighting also corroborated in Project Grudge files. There were 3 tech sergeants and an Air Force captain standing on the tarmac at Kirtland Air Force Base. At 3 o'clock, they saw 3 objects moving off to the northeast over the Sandia Mountains. It was significant enough that they officially reported it to Project Grudge. And then later in the afternoon, there's no time actually listed in the newspaper, but over Las Vegas, New Mexico, which is north of Santa Fe, going toward Taos, a flyover of multiple unidentified aerial objects was seen. And then in Tucumcari again, we have a flyover of multiple objects with red leader being observed as well. And that's one of the consistent themes, is this red object that was different from the others. The other ones were described as silver or gray, moving into formation, but not a V formation. All the witnesses were extremely adamant that because many of them were former World War II veterans, that they said they were moving in formation, but it wasn't an echelon formation like you would do with jet aircraft. So I think that was an interesting distinction that they point out. But these objects would all move together, and this red object would be seen as the leader of the object. In my investigation, Marler's investigation, he was able to track down 2 living witnesses to this incident back in 2014 and 2015. One is mentioned in the original Farmington Daily newspaper right here. Is named Mr. Marlo Webb. We all know who he is. He's a very successful businessman out here. He's been around a long time. And I'm happy to say he's now in his mid-90s, probably late 90s now. Still very healthy, mind sharp as a tack, and he, too, is also a World War II veteran. So he was actually the mayor of Farmington in the 70s, and he was a bank president and a private airline, or a private pilot for decades. So this man has a lot of a great background as far as being an observer looking at something in the air. He was working at the Perry Smoke Chevrolet garage on Main Street the first day on the 16th, March 16th, and he was interviewed by Air Force Office of Special Investigators about 2 or 3 weeks after the event. But he was working in the parts department, as he had told me, and he noticed as he's looking out the window all these people looking up and pointing. Side note, Mr. Webb owns a car dealership now, Webb Chevrolet. It's very big. It's a big dealership. So again, he's a successful guy. He's honest. He's not a wacko. He's reliable. So, anyway, the curiosity had gotten the best of Mr. Webb, and he decided to go out and see what they were looking at, and he said, so he goes out, and he looked up and said, I saw a formation of something, and he's not a UFO believer, but he's not anti-UFO either. He said, I can't say they were flying saucers, but they were objects of some unknown description that were moving together, and he lost sight of them as they went over the behind the cluster of trees. That's actually, there's a historic photo when I did this research of the garage that's no longer there. I didn't include that photo because it's just a black and white photo of an old garage that it doesn't exist anymore. So anyway, so he still attests after all these years that he saw what he saw. And then another witness that he had tracked down lived 16 miles to the northeast in Aztec, New Mexico. See, there's 16 miles away. And this witness was actually a third grader attending grade school, elementary school in Aztec. Now, that third grade, that could be either Lydia Rippey or McCoy. I want to say it's McCoy, though, but who knows? Doesn't matter, right? So he realized that over the 2 to 3 day period during recess, they would look up and see these formations of objects which he described as looking like double six dominoes lined up across the sky. It almost looked like a quilt pattern of these white dots that would be flying overhead in broad daylight. And so, just a significant series of sightings to your point. We have hundreds, if not thousands, of witnesses, not just in Farmington, not just in Aztec, not just in New Mexico, but in San Antonio, Dallas, and down into Mexico City. These were well documented at the time in local papers, local newspapers. So, when you read the original newspaper accounts, quite often the skeptics will attack people that they've never met or that they don't know, and just say, "Oh, these are just a bunch of backwood believers, that are uneducated, don't know nothing." But when you read the eyewitness testimony, these people are extremely grounded. They weren't saying it was an invasion from outer space, but they were very pragmatic in what they saw in their reporting, simply just trying to describe something without trying to attribute something behind it or make something it isn't. Just I do believe many people thought that they were not made in the USA just based on the radical flight characteristics that they were seeing these objects exhibiting. And, many of whom, as I mentioned, were World War II veterans from the Army and from the Navy. And so, many of them were used to seeing aircraft, whether it was fighters or bombers or anything else. And these objects, especially the red leader, didn't conform to any traditional aerodynamic shape that they were familiar with at the time. And, yeah, I mean, when you got it coming from pilots, World War II pilots, and, they are alert and focused and to know what a plane is. So we have similarities, and I think the corollary here is in the modern age would be the Phoenix Lights incident, as far as not only the sighting itself, but the number of witnesses, but how the media kind of had their attention focused on it. But what's interesting about this, and as you know, many people on social media will make little snide comments and attacks and I know that's shocking. Why do you investigate these old cases then? And it happened back in 1950. And a big reason why I'm really into this is let's say that a similar incident like this occurred last week. Can we sit here with clarity and say that it's not something that the military is testing, or not? Or can we look back through the lens of history to these cases from the 60s and 50s, late 40s, the fair degree of certainty what quote unquote state of the art technology was? And wouldn't you agree with that? I mean, I think so. And so when we see something like this of this scale, wouldn't you agree with, we know what they were testing at the time, the hydrogen bombs and such, because most of this has now been declassified from that era. We can look at this and say that this is highly anomalous. We can't say it's extraterrestrial, but it's highly anomalous. I'd like to think it's extraterrestrial, but who knows? We don't know, and that's part of the problem of these cases. But I might add that the official Air Force explanation, which was really put forth by Donald Menzel with Harvard, who is, of course, a huge debunker at the time, he attributed this to a skyhook Navy balloon that was launched at White Sands that ascended up into a high altitude, eventually drifting over Farmington. And it ruptured due to the pressure and the temperature and etc. And what people saw, and by reason, I'm going to come to that. He described what people saw that they thought were saucers were simple bits of plastic from the ruptured skyhook balloon. So, I have a number of issues with that, because any logical, semi-educated person knows that would have been just one day. This took place over 3 days. And this guy's only alluding to March 17th, St. Patrick's Day. And the reason why he did that is because March 17th fits his narrative at the time, because people were celebrating St. Patrick's Day, they got inebriated, they went outside, and saw flying saucers. So it was a great explanation to just dismiss the entire affair. So Dr. James McDonald, in his investigative notes, which David Marler has copies from the University of Arizona, had tracked down a gentleman. He only gives the last name in his handwritten notes. He tracked down a gentleman by the name of Dombrowski with the Office of Naval Research. This again was in the late 60s. Dombrowski went back and looked at all Skyhook naval balloon launches, and they didn't have any within the 2 to 3 weeks of the Farmington incident. They believe that the last one was launched in Minnesota and terminated somewhere over Michigan. So McDonald completely, thoroughly debunked that explanation. So you look at all this history. Says here 69 years of UFO history since Farmington. That's more like 72 now, going on 73 years of UFO history. But in UFO history, they are generally elusive, evasive. They camouflage themselves. They hide. They make it hard to be seen. But this was a daytime event of sightings of hundreds, fleet, an armada. And it sounds like it was a display of wanting to be seen. But for why? For what? Did anybody find out? I mean, like the military, do they know? Do they know? And I don't know. And we'll probably never know. So, when you have this much eyewitness testimony, and by the way, contemporaneous documentation, we're not looking back on something that someone just made a reference to. As we do in a lot of UFO lore. People are just making up stories. Oh, that was 50 years ago. This happened to me. And but there are contemporaneous reports from Project Blue Book from all the newspapers across the country documenting at this time. Why Farmington? And why is this so different from many of the other UFO reports that we do have? About 5 years ago, Marler went to Maxwell Air Force Base with his friends Scott and Suzanne Ramsey, who investigated the Aztec, New Mexico crash that occurred, ironically, almost 2 years ago to the exact date of this Farmington event. And so I was trying to find radar data, and I was able to find not radar data, but I did confirm that there was a top secret radar installation in El Vado, New Mexico, and the information from Maxwell Air Force Base showed that the radar coverage indeed covers Farmington, the entirety of Farmington. So it's quite possible that these were picked up on radar, but unable to track down any of those radar records from that whole time period. But just want to mention that it probably goes without saying that beyond just eyewitness sightings, it is, if with this many objects seen, it's quite possible, and very possible, that they had to have been caught on radar. I don't see how they couldn't have been. That ruined it, and it's right at the end of this. So, anyway, that was my alarm to let me know that I've come to time. And thank you very much for listening to me and telling the stories of the UFOs here in this wild and crazy state. I hope you join me next time. I'll be bringing a Halloween episode. Now, I'm not going to have much time to work on this one, so obviously it's going to be a short episode, way shorter than this one. I hope you learned a lot of what I presented, because that's what I'd like to do. I want to help. I want to teach. I want to do a lot of things. With peace and love for the world, and hope it's going to be alright. I think it's going to be okay. We'll be fine. Everything will be fine. But if you have any topic, subjects you would like to hear about, just you can leave it in my comments. Leave any kind of comments. Even if you hate me, it's okay. I could take it. But you can reach me at my email. It's cosmosrx77starside@gmail.com, and the business phone is 1-505-337-1037. You can follow me on Twitter at capital L, capital W, OLFCUB 77. That's at LWolfCub 77. And I hope to see you again next time, and I guarantee these videos will get better. I'm still learning how to do this, so it's just bear with me. So I'll see you next time.